Well, this is David Archer, and I'm in the home, the lovely museum-like home of Jim and Jane Mcelreath. I've known Jim, I guess, all my life, and I'm going to ask him about some of his memories and recollections and stories about growing up in Cartersville. Now, Jim, you and I both grew up in Cartersville on West Avenue. And I want to talk to you a little bit about your family, your siblings, your daddy, your mama. I want to talk to you a little bit about going to school in Cartersville, where you went, what you did after school, and I want to talk about the war years, because you were a young man during World War II. I barely remember it, but I bet you remember a lot of it. So first,
yes, I do.
Tell me about where you grew up in Cartersville.
Well, I grew up at 722 West Avenue, and was there with my brothers. I had 7 brothers and sisters, and I was the youngest of the family, and I grew up. I was born in 1930, so when the war started, if you're talking about the war years, I remember the very day that Pearl Harbor was bombed, and remember where we were, where I was the day that Pearl Harbor was attacked and all, and of course realized what it meant and all like that because of the war. And I remember, I'm kind of off track now, I'm talking about the war, but I remember the next day after Pearl Harbor that 2 of my brothers quit their jobs, and joined the Army. Everybody was joining the Army that day. It seemed like around Cartersville and there. But both of my brothers called us and told them that they weren't living at home, but told us that they were going into the Army, and they both signed up.
Now, which brothers were those?
That was my brother Pierce and my brother Sam. My brother Robert worked for the Corps of Engineers and had a family, and he was exempt. And my father, ironically, was head of the draft board then. It was drafting. They had the selective service, and my father was chairman of the board that drafted everybody in Cartersville. And I think that, I don't know if it was patriotic when my brothers joined up, or whether they knew they'd be the first ones that my dad would get because he was getting all the other young men in Cartersville to go into service.
Now, during the war, Robert and Sam served in what branch of the military?
Well, Robert was in the Army. Robert was with the Corps of Engineers, and he was married and had children, and he was exempt until very late in the war. And
so Sam and Pierce.
Sam and Pierce, yeah.
Now Pierce that's your daddy's middle name, I believe.
Right, yes.
And your daddy's first name was Hayden?
Hayden, yes.
But they called him HP.
Yes.
Everybody called him HP.
That's right.
So I guess Pierce was he a junior? Was he named after your father?
No.
But his first name was Pierce.
Right, yes.
And what branch of the service was he?
He was in the Air Force at the time. It was part of the Army.
Army Air Corps.
Yeah, and he actually flew a glider over the channel on D-Day, one of those. It was a glider pilot, and landed in France.
So both of them stayed in all until World War II ended?
Yes.
All right. So when they got out, what did they do?
Well, my brother Pierce, he went back. He worked for Greyhound Company, driving a bus, and he went to that. And my brother Sam moved to Salt Lake City. He'd been stationed out there sometimes during the war, and he'd met a girl out there, and he went there and married her and stayed and lived there.
So now Robert stayed here and worked at the Corps of Engineers.
Right.
But what did he do after the war?
After the war, well, he stayed with the Corps of Engineers. He went on to help design Lake Ackworth and all of that, and then he moved down in somewhere in Mississippi. They were building a dam. I think it was Mississippi. It might have been Louisiana, and he was building. The Corps of Engineers, who he worked for, was building a lake down there, and he helped him down there.
So other than Robert, Sam, and Pierce, what other brothers and sisters?
Well, I had H.P. was my oldest brother, and he was in the Navy for a short time. And then my sister Mildred, she was a dietitian, and she went in the Army and stayed in the Army for a long time in the medical corps. And I remember I was stationed in Germany when I was in the service, and she was over there, and she was a captain, and I was a private, and I used to be kidded because I had to salute my sister.
Yeah. Now, I suppose you began school at the Cherokee Avenue.
Yes.
Elementary school, same place I went?
Yes.
And what years did you go there?
If I can remember straight.
Really, what grades, not years?
1 through 7. They only had 7 grades there.
And then after the 7th grade,
Went to high school.
the high school was next door?
Right.
Tell us about that building.
It was a huge building, an old building. It was 3 stories. They had a basement in it. And I remember after World War II, the basement, they had one room down there that there was a lot of surplus equipment left that the government had, and they were just giving it out, and mainly it was scientific type material and things, and there was a room down there just full of that. I never will forget that.
I remember when I was at Cherokee Avenue School some years after you were, the cafeteria that the elementary school kids would go over and eat in that cafeteria in that basement.
Right, yeah.
Was the cafeteria there when you were there?
Yes, it was.
Okay. So then you graduated from Cartersville High School when?
That's, as I told you, my memory may lapse from some time.
Well, that's okay. It doesn't
I
matter
think it
what
was,
year. What did you do after you graduated from Cartersville High School?
I enrolled in North Georgia State College and went to school there.
Up in Dahlonega?
Yes.
Did you stay there for 4 years?
I stayed there, and I transferred to Emory. I finally got accepted to Emory, and I went down there, and I was in school there. And when the Korean War broke out in 1950, in a fit of patriotism, several of us were foolish enough to go join the Army. And I joined the Army and stayed in for 4 years there.
Did you actually see service in Korea?
No, I was sent to Germany in Berlin, and that was when the Russians had the East Zone there. I mean, had their zone. Berlin, Germany was
East and West Germany, and built a wall in the middle of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember going there on a train, and I was in a unit called the Army Security Agency, and we did codes for the Army. And we took our machines with us. We had coding machines, and all these machines were in these heavy safes that you could type on them, and then if something happened, you could close them. And they had these bombs inside. You'd push something, like the enemy was come close, you would push a bomb, and it would melt the machine in there, and the enemy wouldn't get it. But we had our machines, and we were taking those with us, and they wouldn't let us the machines were so big, they didn't want them put in in the regular passenger cars, we went through East Germany. So they put us in a boxcar with our code machines. They were big, heavy safes, and they said that we had to ride back there with us, so they would not let the machines go up alone. And I remember riding up there, and they loaded the machines up, and they handed me a machine gun, and said, "You can ride up front till we get to the border, and then you have to go back there and sit with your machine till we get to the American section of Germany in Berlin." So I went back there and sat down, and there was a lot of things back there, and it was a boxcar, and it had one little old window with bars on it. And we finally got to the border of East Germany and West Germany and stopped, and the Russians were out there, and they were inspecting things, and I remember they had flashlights, and so they came up to the window, and I hid down behind some boxes, and they shined the lights in there. And there was some produce in there. There was a big sack of bananas there right on top of some boxes and everything they were shipping up there. And we could hear the Russians out there talking. And then all of a sudden they'd shine their flashlights in, and I ducked down and they couldn't see me. But all of a sudden I saw this broom type thing coming through that little window. And they were sticking a broom in there, and they hooked it onto those bunch of bananas that was up there, and lifted it up, and he eased it right over to that little window. And the little window had bars, and they reached in and would pick off bananas of that thing.
The Russians stole your bananas?
Yeah, and I said, well, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I got a machine gun. I said, if I shoot at them, I'll start World War III. So I just stay hid, and finally the train moved on, and we had no more stops to inspect us or anything. But finally I got up, and there was a few bananas left on the floor, and I went over and had myself one.
Well, tell me, my family grew up, I think, 3 or 4 doors down, or lived 3 or 4 doors down from where you grew up. And tell us about that house that you grew up in on West Avenue and what was around it. I tell you, I remember going out my back door, and there were woods as far as you could see where the houses now. Tell us about what it was like back then.
Well, we lived back from the street high on the top of the hill, and the house, when my father bought it, had a huge barn back there. It was huge. It was almost as big as a house. And I remember, of course, we would go back as kids and play and climb up in the loft and have corncob battles, because we were so far back that my father kept a cow back there. We had pigs and all of that in the barn, and we had fields back there that we had big gardens in and things like that. And the barn would attract, I think you probably came up there and played in it sometime too.
Yeah.
Everybody, all the kids in the neighborhood and from town would come out there and play around the barn. We'd play war and have corncob battles and all stuff like that.
Yeah.
And but it was an attraction for a lot of the kids, and we had a lot of fun out there. There was a lot of places to hide around there, and we played a lot of kick the can, where you would kick the can, somebody would hide, and there were just hundreds of places to hide.
I remember playing kick the can. That was something that we played in that neighborhood a lot. Now, there was the house you grew up in was up on the hill.
Right.
And down in the flat part, just west of the house, that you grew up in on property that I think your daddy owned, there was a little house.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about that little house.
Well, that was once the parsonage at Sam Jones Methodist Church. And when they built the new parsonage, he bought it. And his plan was to just move it down the street to a vacant lot he had bought down there. But when they started to move it, they found they couldn't get it down to the street. So he had that house he had bought, and he had to move it because they were going to build a Methodist parsonage there.
And that parsonage they built was right across from Sam Jones Methodist
Right,
Church.
same one.
Corner of what, Church Street, and Irwin Street.
Irwin Street.
Yeah, that house is still there, I believe. Today.
Yes, and so he had to dismantle the house. So they took the house apart, board by board, and things like that, and they hauled it out and put it down in that lot at the corner of our property.
And then I guess your daddy just rented that to different families.
And rented it out.
Now, behind the big house on the hill that you grew up in, there was, I remember, a two-room, what I would call a shack, that I remember a family that lived in it. Do you remember that?
Yeah, there was actually a 3-room house.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and he was a rental house there. And he had built that house years before for his father, who moved out there, and his father was a widow, and he built that house new so he could live down there. And my father lived in the big house up there. And, of course, he had 7 children there then, and so they were full, so he built that house down there for his father. And his father was old, and I forgot, this was a lot before I was born, and he finally died, so he just used it as a rental house.
Mm-hmm. I remember families that lived back there.
Yes.
Tell us about the neighbors along West Avenue that you recall. Who were your neighbors?
Well, Mr. Eves, Judd Eves, lived next door. He was sold fire trucks, and I really liked him because he had all these pictures of fire trucks, and I was just a kid, and he would bring them up and give them to me. And then sometimes he took me down to the fire station down there, and he would eat with the firemen up there, and I would eat with them there. They would let us eat up there because he sold fire trucks, and he knew them all, and we would go upstairs. And then I'd get to slide down the pole there too. So he was a good neighbor that I really enjoyed.
You know, before he started selling, I think he worked for American LaFrance.
Yes.
Or as they say, LaFrance.
Yeah.
We say LaFrance. He was actually the fire chief, one of the early fire chiefs for the city of Cartersville.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
But anyway, he was a good neighbor. He was one neighbor. And then Mr. Hamrick, who was in the coal business, lived in one house. I don't think that house is still there. It was torn down. And the Eves house, where Judd Eves lives, is still there.
Yeah.
And
they tore the Hamrick house down and the house next door to build the house that Joe Frank Harris lives in there.
Right, yes.
Now tell me about Mr. Hamrick, because I remember Mr. Hamrick as being the meanest man I ever knew in my whole life. Did you think that?
Well, I didn't know him that well. I knew he used to be an educator. He taught school, and somewhere up, I think around Resaca somewhere, he taught school. And I think he had some daughters. I think he had twin daughters, didn't he?
I don't remember. Yeah, I do.
He had 2 daughters, and then his wife was a school teacher or something there. I remember all of that.
Where was his coal business in Cartersville?
I don't it was over, I do too. It's over now.
On Leak Street?
No, it was...
Right by the railroad track?
It was by the railroad track, but it was on what is Main Street now.
Okay.
As you go on out where the Tribune is, on down from there, there's some garages there.
Yeah.
It was down there.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you why I think he was a mean man. Is our property, where our little house I grew up in, backed up to his property. And Daddy had a bull that kept getting loose and going over into Mr. Hamrick's cornfield. And Mr. Hamrick got mad about it. And Daddy would go get the bull and bring it back. A little bitty, it was a baby bull. And so Mr. Hamrick, the third time the bull went over there, Mr. Hamrick had poisoned his corn because he was sick and tired of that bull coming over there getting in his corn. And our bull ate his poisoned corn and died in his garden. And he made Daddy come get the bull out of his garden. So I always thought he was a mean man. Maybe he was.
Yes, so.
Now, next to Mr. Hamrick was Steve Wiley. Do you remember Steve? Worked for the railroad?
No, I think that was after I'd left.
Oh. Okay, then of course next to Steve Wiley's house was my grandparents' house.
Right,
Do you
yeah.
remember them?
Oh, gosh, yeah.
What do you remember about my grandparents? And my Aunt Martha that lived in the house?
Well, really nice people, and I knew my mother, I think, knew her, and I would take some things down there, baked goods or something down there to them sometimes. I remember that. And was your grandfather the one that had the wholesale business?
That was my daddy.
That was your daddy. I remember him very well.
Yeah.
I don't think I remember your grandfather.
He died in 1936. So worked for Jones Mercantile. But now tell me about your daddy fishing, because, and I'll tell you why I'm interested in that, is when my brother Russell, who is one of the better fishermen in Bartow County today, when he was 8, 9 years old, your daddy taught my brother Russell to fly fish. And apparently your daddy was an expert fly fisherman. Is that right?
Yes.
Tell me about his fishing.
Well, he loved to fish, and he would fly fishing. He would go out and wade the creeks in North Georgia all the way up and fly fish, and they would catch red-eyed trout. And he was an expert at it, and I would go with him sometime, but I didn't. He had boots. He would just wear some. He didn't have hip boots like they wear now. He just had rather leather boots, and he would just with hobs on the bottom so that they could walk on the rocks good. And he would just wade up there and fish, and then he would come back and pick up me, and we'd go home. And he'd just do that on Wednesday afternoon when he was closed. And I remember one time that I sat on a big rock down there at some creek, and I went to sleep up there, and he wasn't catching any fish, and he'd forgotten about me. And I was still asleep, and he came back, and I think Warren Aiken was with him that day and going fishing with him that day. And they were talking, I guess, or something, and they went off and just left me sleep on that rock. And I think they got down the road and remembered that there was something they'd left behind. And they went back and they woke me up and took me on home. I was real young then. But Warren Aiken was one of his fishing buddies. He would go fishing with him.
Now, your daddy was a dentist.
Right.
Tell us about where his office was and about his dentistry.
Well, his office was above Young Brothers Drugstore, and there was an office up there. It was his office, and he had a waiting room up there and 2 dental chairs, the office there, and then he had a room in back, a laboratory. He did all his own work on making dentures and things. He did them himself.
He's actually the first dentist I ever went to as a child in that office.
Oh, really?
And I remember it.
A lot of people remember all the stuffed animals he had in there that scared the kids when they came up. He would because he was a great outdoorsman and hunted and fished, and he would have a taxidermy, do things, and they were all over the walls.
Yeah, I
there.
remember. Let me let's talk about your daddy serving as mayor. I think before you were born or when you were born.
Well,
I think he was mayor of Cartersville in 1928 and 29.
no,
Do you know anything about his term as mayor?
no, I was born in 1930, so I don't.
Yeah. Well, now I found an old newspaper from 1929 that's got a picture of your daddy,
Right.
who was mayor at that time. And then I believe, well, I'll tell you that the first paved streets in Cartersville were on West Main Street when your daddy was mayor.
Right.
He instituted a program to start paving streets. He started that. But now, what do you know about after your daddy was mayor? He ran for the Georgia legislature. What do you know about that?
Well, I don't remember much except a story he used to tell about my brother Sam, who was young at that time, and he took him to the legislature to be a page down there. And I'd never been in the legislature chamber, but it apparently was up high, and there was some steps to go up there. And my brother I guess he got through doing what he was supposed to have done and sat down on the steps and went to sleep. And all of a sudden he toppled off of those steps and just kind of fell down. And the governor, who was not Ellis Arnold, but
Talmadge.
no,
Wasn't before him?
before Talmadge.
Hardwick?
No.
I can't remember who it was.
But whoever the governor was, so he interrupted his speech and walked down and picked him up and brought him back up and set him on the stairs. And I remember that about that story about the legislature, but I was apparently he wasn't. I apparently wasn't even born when he was in the legislature. But I remember him when he was on the Board of Education. He was chairman of the Board of Education, and one Sunday, Mcelreath was also on that board, and they were going up to the schools. They wanted to ride around the schools. They were going to do some improvements, and they brought me with them. And so we drove up to the schools, and they would ask me, well, what do we need here? And I said, well, you see those embankments there? Said how worn they are, where we've run down them, and we get penalized if we run down the banks. So we need some steps down those embankments, because if we run down one, they'll penalize us in there, put us in a corner, whatever they did then, I forgot. And so they said, okay. And so all of those steps that are around the schools there in the back that go down those banks.
Talking about that big steep bank that went down to the gymnasium,
all of
the
those.
Cherokee Avenue School.
Yes.
And it was steep.
Yeah, and so they immediately built all those steps in there and put them in, and it was a great thing. But I went around and pointed out where we run down the banks, because we would get penalized or whatever. They forgot what they did then to us, paddle us a lot of time. But you couldn't run down the banks because it was making ruts in them, but we did it anyway. So they put concrete steps there, and so that solved the problem. The banks were no longer, people walked down the steps and were no longer rutted.
Now, at the Cherokee Avenue School, where behind the Cherokee Avenue School or beside it, where the Cartersville Bartow County Library is now, there was the Sam Jones Tabernacle. Do you remember that?
Vaguely. I remember walking to school, and it was abandoned then. And we were always scared of going up there. The kids were, because there was supposed to be ghosts up there.
Yeah.
Under they had some steps under there. And we would run under there and open the door, but we would run. But when I would walk to school, I would cut over the Tabernacle Hill to walk over to West Avenue. And I wouldn't go close to the Tabernacle. It was abandoned and big, and they told all the stories about dead bodies there. So I would have to detour and go way around if I was alone, because I was scared of walking by that big place. It was a huge place.
I've seen pictures of it. I don't remember.
Yeah, it was a huge place. And I remember there was a place where the choir sat at one end, and it was built up, and it was all boarded in, and they had a door where you could go under all these steps there. And that was supposed to be where all the bad stuff had happened. But anyway, I avoided it, so I made it by. But I do remember the tabernacle on that hill there.
Now, across the street from on West Avenue from the house you grew up in, I believe there was a Ms. Lumpkin.
Yes.
Beautiful antebellum house that had porches all the way around. It's not there anymore. What do you remember about that house and Ms. Lumpkin?
Well, she was a widow, and we had almost a farm out there on West Avenue, and we had a cow, and we would churn and make butter and make buttermilk, and the buttermilk was a favorite of everyone, and Ms. Lumpkin always loved it. And when she would call, and we would talk to my mother, and she would she would send her a pint or something of the buttermilk, and of course she would, and I would take it over there, walk all the way over there, and she would be it would be summertime, and she would be sitting on the porch, and she was a old lady, and I remember she was nearly blind, and she was dressed in black, because she was a widow, and I think then that was.
I remember her wearing black.
She wore black all the time.
Yeah.
And long dresses, and I would go over there, and she would tell me to sit down, and she was almost blind, and I would give her the buttermilk, and she would call. She had some help there, or some. I think it was a sister, a daughter lived there with her, I think, and they would bring her a glass out there, and she would pour some of the buttermilk, and she'd tell me to sit down. She wanted to talk to me, and she would. We would talk, but she just asked me about things and just talk. And then she would always give me some money, and I said, "Well, I don't want any money." And she was blind, and when she would take a coin out, I vividly remember this. She could tell what a dime was because she would scratch it with a thumb along the edge, and if it had ridges, she felt the ridges. She had a dime in her hand. And then she would give me a dime. I would, of course, say I didn't want it, but I did, of course, and took it. And but that's pretty good for a child. And during the Depression, that was
Now, you took that dime and gave it to your daddy, didn't you?
No. I took that dime and spent it at the store down the road. But anyway, but I always remembered her giving me, scratching that with her hand and being blind there, so she could tell she had a little purse, and she would open it, and she would take out these coins, and although she was blind, she could tell which coins, the denomination of the coins, by feeling them.
I think one of her daughters, she had more than one, but one of them was Margaretta, who married Bud Shaw, who tore that house down, the Lumpkin house, and built the house that's there today.
Yes.
Now, just on the if you're facing the old Lumpkin house was, on the right there was a house that sat way back off the road that John Hodge and his family eventually moved into.
Yes.
Who lived in that house when you were growing up?
let's see, they had, I remember, it's going to take me a second to remember the names, but they had twin girls there. I remember that. Their name was Nelsons. They were Nelsons. That was
Yeah, I didn't know them.
and they had twin girls about the age of my youngest sister, and they were good friends.
Yeah.
But they moved out later. But
And then John Hodge bought it. I think
Right.
that house has been torn down now with plans to build another house where it was.
Right.
Now, next to the Hodge, what the Nelson or the Hodge house was where the Griffin Mumford
Right,
lived.
yes,
You remember
sir.
Griffin and that
oh
house?
yes, uh-huh.
What do you remember about them?
Well, I remember about Miss Griffin. She was very old, and she lived there. And squirrels, there's two big oak trees. I think they're still there.
Yeah. In the front yard.
Right, and
Yeah.
she would call me, and she knew that I hunted and all like that. And when I was young, I had a shotgun even when I was probably in grammar school, because we used to hunt in the back there. And she called me and told me wanted me to bring my shotgun down there and load it. And I said, I was at home by myself, so I said, yes, ma'am. So I loaded my shotgun and took it down there. And she said, there's two squirrels up in that big tree out there, and I don't like them. I think they're going to ruin my tree. And I said, well, I don't know. I didn't think they would, but I didn't say anything. She said, will you please kill them for me? And I said, yes, ma'am. So I went out there and I shot the two squirrels for her. And I shot them, and I took them by the tail up there, and I think she gave me a quarter or something, and I went home and went out and buried the squirrels somewhere back toward the lime sink back there. But I never will forget going down there and shooting those squirrels for her. She was real old, and I think she was, didn't know what squirrels were doing in her tree, and of course they weren't doing anything, but she
You
wanted.
mentioned lime sink.
Yeah.
And lime sink, anybody that grew up in Cartersville during that period of time knows about the lime sink. Tell us about the lime sink.
Well, the lime sink was a lime sink. It was what the lime sink is where there's a lot of lime, the lime, and there was lime in Ladd's Mountain out there. They mined lime out there. And it's where water just comes up, and it makes a natural lake there, a pond, and there's no inlet of water coming except from the ground. And it was a big pond in that place, and we played around there all the time. We had paths. One edge was real steep, and we had made paths where we could run along.
I remember those paths.
Run along those edges of those paths in there.
I wondered who made those paths. When I came along a few years later, those paths were still there.
Well, I think they were made. I know my brothers used to play back there, and so I imagine that they probably had something to do with it. I don't know. But we would play back there, and it was supposed to be that there was a myth that this was that the lime sink did not have a bottom,
That's what we told.
and that if you threw something in there, it went all the way
To China.
to China.
China, I remember.
And of course, unfortunately, that was a place that you would go over there and peep at someone that had a dead animal. They would, bad spot, they would throw it in there. That's why I never fished there, although there were fish, and that people did fish there.
Next to the Griffin house, the Mumford house, was the Gatewoods. You remember the Gatewoods?
Yes.
What do you remember about them?
Well, I remember their two daughters, who were Gwen and
Gwen, who became Granny
yeah,
at Cartersville High School. She taught for 50 years or so.
yeah, and I forgot the other
Ann.
yeah.
Yeah.
But I remember we were teenagers, and we used to go down there, and at night in the summertime, and out on the sidewalk they had a wall around the house, and we would sit out there and talk.
Rock wall.
Right, and you may have gone out there and talked with us, I don't know.
Yeah, I grew up across the street.
Yeah.
So. All right, next to the Gatewoods was Louise Milam. You remember Louise?
I never knew her, but I remember, I believe it was her son that was crippled and walked on crutches.
Yeah.
And he was...
No, that was her brother.
That was her brother?
John.
John, yeah.
John.
And he walked on crutches, and he was some official up at the courthouse, I remember that.
Yeah, he was. I don't remember what, but yeah,
Milam, I think.
He was her brother. She never married.
Yeah.
Never had children. Now, before we started, you told me about this table. Tell us about this table that we're seated at.
Well, this table is, I'm an old man, but this table's older than I am. It's was made, I have a picture of the man over there that made it. And the man was my great grandfather, and he made it and sawed the wood, and it was made with pegs. But because some of the boards cracked, they're very wide, and we've had to put some nails in it to keep it together. But this table was on the back porch of our house on West Avenue, and we used it because we kept pigs at our farm on West Avenue, so to speak. And or else he would buy a whole pig, and we would butcher it up out there, and it's got all these marks on it where it was used out there. That's what it was used for. And then when they would cut the meat up out there, and he always liked to take shoulders of the meat, and we would make our own ham and grind sausage and make sausage on that, and then we had a grinder and do sausage. And he did this because he remembered this. My father did it from his youth when he lived on a farm, and they would put sausage, we'd grind up sausage, and we would shuck corn and put it in corn shucks and tie it on the edge. And we would tie on the back, we would tie a string across the back porch, a place there, and we would have strings of sausages that were preserved in corn shucks hung across there.
I've never heard of that.
But we had it, and they were good too. They're very delicious.
Now, talking about your daddy, I heard a story before we started this morning about your daddy in his practice of dentistry was the one who treated the men who were in the chain gang.
Yes.
Tell us about the chain gang, where it was, what it was,
Yeah.
and then what your daddy did with regards to it.
All right. On West Avenue, they had built a state chain gang out on the top of the hill as you go out West Avenue.
Still call it Chain Gang Hill.
Yeah, Chain Gang Hill. And they'd built a chain gang out there. And I went out there with him one time and actually went in there, and it was not a very desirable place to be. But then they would bring some of the patients or the prisoners that had trouble with their teeth down to my father, and they would bring them down on Sunday afternoon. And they would bring them down in chains, and they would be chained around their foot, and had these pickaxes, and that was before that chain gang got written up in Life magazine and all.
I've seen that all about brutality.
Yeah.
Abusive.
But they would bring them down, and they would bring them down to do mainly just pull their teeth, I guess. But I would go down there with him and sit in the waiting room, and it would be Sunday afternoon, and they would start bringing them up the steps. and you could hear them come up those steps and hear those chains dragging as they came up, you know. And they got up there and they came in and they made them all sit down over there. And they would take them in, and Daddy said, well, take the chains off. I can't do anything with those guys' chain. And they said, we can't do that. That's against the rules. He said, well, I can't do any work on them with them chain. He said, you take the chains off or you get somebody else. And so they said, well, we took them off. So they took them off, and hands were free and everything, and he did the work, you know. And they all got through. They seemed to like him. When they stood up, I remember this, and they were getting ready to go. They stood up and they would shake his hand. And then they put the chains back on him and then around the legs, and they took them back downstairs. And I also remember he did the dental work at what they call the poor farm, or
Up on 411?
411, and I remember going
Above White?
Yeah, going out there, and he would go in the rooms. I stayed outside and do what work they needed on their teeth inside.
Were there other dentists in town at that time?
Yes.
There were several, weren't there? Why was your daddy doing that work and the other dentists weren't doing it, I wonder?
It was politics. My dad had been mayor, and Ellis Arnold, you know, and he knew all these people, and so frankly, it was it. And he
got the state contract.
That's right, and he knew Mcelreath, who was the big, down there. He and Mcelreath were close friends, and
he had the hardware store on Main Street.
He had the drugstore.
Oh, the drugstore. That became Champions later.
No,
another one.
No, yeah, it was down. This Young Brothers drugstore. Then there was the hardware store, right. Geary's, and then there was the drugstore. It was Geary's drugstore, and Mcelreath ran it, and he was on everything down there. He and my father and Luke Pettit and some of them, they were the big people that kind of did things, I guess, around town is what you call it.
The big dogs.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, after you got out of the service, you came back to Carter,
mm-hmm.
and then eventually, what did you do first when you got out of the military?
Well, I went back to college and graduated from the University of Georgia.
Okay, and then at some point in time you started a printing business. When did you start that?
Well, I went to work at the Marietta Daily Journal in 1960, and I worked there as a reporter and a writer for a whole 10 years. And they started putting out newspapers and satellite newspapers around, like Marietta owns them all now, I think. But they were going to start some, and they asked me if I wanted to go up and start one in Ackworth. And they would even let me buy interest in it, part of the paper. And I said yes. And I said, that's an awful small town. I said, why don't we start one up in Kennesaw at the same time? And they said, if you want to, just do what you want to. So I bought some stock in it, and they own most of it, and I went and started that paper. But we bought it from a man from Cartersville, Eugene Watkins. He was lived in Cartersville for a long time, but he was in the printing business, his family was. And he had a printing business down there, and he was putting out a little paper down there. And of course, they bought it, but they didn't buy his printing equipment and all. So anyway, I went up and started it, and I had an office there. But make a long story short, I bought some of it. I got interested in working in there with him and being around the presses down in Marietta. I got interested in printing, and I never will forget, I would work there at Marietta, and the publisher of the paper there was a real nice man, and Brooks Smith, and Mustang automobiles came out, and he had a Mustang car, and he parked it in the alleyway down there sometime, in an alleyway where the building was. And one day he said, "Jim, would you go and move my car? They can't get a truck in down there." Something. Said, "Sure, be glad to." So I went down there and drove one of those Mustangs, and I thought, I got to thinking, I said, what's the difference between me and the publisher of that newspaper? And he owns a Mustang, and I own something, I don't know, some rag of a car. And I said, well, the difference is that he owns printing presses. So I got real interested in printing presses after that.
All because of that Mustang.
That's right. And actually, I finally bought a Mustang.
Yeah. And I had a similar story. After I graduated from the University of Georgia, I took the LSAT entrance exam to see if you could qualify to get into law school, and I didn't think I did very well. It was on a Saturday morning, and so that afternoon, I decided I needed to buy me a 65 Mustang. That's the year it came out. Mm-hmm. I decided I needed to buy a 1965 Mustang since it appeared that I would not be going to law school. So I went to the dealership, and I told the guy that I wanted this British Racing Green 1965 Mustang, brand new, sitting on his lot, and I want to buy it. I want to buy it right now. He asked me how I was going to finance it, and I told him, well, my brother works for First National Bank in Cartersville, and he'll make me a loan. So I gave him my brother's number, and the salesman called my brother and told him that I was there to buy a Mustang. And my brother Russell said, put David on the phone. And so I got on the phone, and Russell says, what are you doing? I thought you were going to law school. And I said, well, I don't think I did very well on that LSAT, and I probably won't be going to law school, so I'm going to buy me a Mustang. And I need you to make me a loan. He said, well, I won't make you a loan. Let me talk to that salesman. He told the salesman he declined making me a loan, and I could not buy that Mustang. And about 2 weeks later, I found out I passed the exam, and I was admitted into law school. So, you know, your Mustang story is it got you in the printing business, and my Mustang story is it got me into law school.
Boy, everybody wanted those Mustangs.
Yeah, I'd like to have one now.
I sure would. But yeah, that's how I got mine. I finally got one, and and I enjoyed it too.
Well, Jim, we've enjoyed this considerably. We're sitting in your house out on Old Alabama Road that is a museum. It may be called a house or a home, but it is a museum. Now, at some point in time in the 1990s, I think around 1995, you found a new bride. Who was that?
That was Jane, and I married Jane, and we are very happily here on the farm.
And she, I think, is a lawyer.
Yes, she's a lawyer.
Used to be an English teacher.
Yes.
Does she correct your English when you mess up?
She corrects me many times.
And the two of you live here in this beautiful house out in the country, and appear to be very comfortably situated.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Well, you're quite welcome. I've enjoyed talking with you about the old days.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.